Okay, so today we're looking at a chapter from a book by Professor Lee Binford, co-authored with Preibisch, on a particular phenomenon within what's called the SAWP. It's a labor program that brings workers primarily from the Caribbean and Mexico to Canada on a seasonal basis under particular contract conditions. We'll get to a little bit more of that later on. But the thing that I want to get from this piece then is what it looks like to do ethnography while employing a kind of materialist approach. So what it looks like to be an inheritor of Marx's materialist methodology, let's say. And I'll flag that in a couple places through the lecture, but the thing that I want you to try to remain alert to as we're going through it and as you're looking at this piece is what about it sounds an awful lot like an echo of what we saw in Marx. Another name for this approach within not just anthropology, sociology as well, is political economy. And so, again, the idea here is that the emphasis is on material conditions and how a focus on material conditions, especially around economic social arrangements, illuminates particular aspects of social life and social arrangements. Now, right out of the gate, we get this little tip from Binford and Preibisch when they discuss the addition of the Mexican brand, as they put it, of labor to the shelves of the contract labor supermarket. As if you can imagine, there's a big supermarket that you can go into, you can get different sorts of commodities. Labor is one of the commodities that you can get, and so one of the brands will be, say, Jamaican in the case of the SAWP, but another brand will be Mexican. And so you, as a potential employer, will go and gather the various different elements of your production process. So in this case, they'll have, say, stone fruit trees like peaches. You'll have the water that you need, all of those various different sorts of inputs, and labor. So they're thinking then, Binford and Preibisch that is, they're thinking of labor as a commodity, one commodity among other commodities that producers will purchase. Why do they do that? Well, because they are, as they put it, surplus value hungry horticulturalists in Canada. Right? So again, this sounds an awful lot like Marx, right? This idea of surplus value, that Canadian horticulturalists, these are the growers, the owners of the farms and the greenhouses and so forth, they're looking for ways to generate as much surplus value as they can. That's where they're going to be able to make money. And so whether they choose Mexican laborers or Jamaican laborers will, at least in their view, affect whether or not they can extract more surplus labor or less. And the name of the game for them is extracting the most possible surplus value. This is not unique to them, of course. This is what any owner of a capitalist enterprise seeks to do. Okay, so that's the basic setup. We can already see they're thinking in these terms. They're studying specifically what happens when Canadian growers have multiple sources of, as it were, third world contract laborers. The contract is an important thing here, right? So that Just as when, let's say when you buy a car, you sign a contract with the seller, you get the car, you have the seller has a contractual obligation to deliver to you the thing that he or she has promised to sell, and you therefore have ownership through the contract over that thing. We can imagine then that if we're thinking of labor as a commodity, somewhat like other commodities, it's not exactly like other commodities, but somewhat like other commodities, then when we have a contract with the worker, if we're the owners, then they have a particular obligation to deliver us what it is that we've stipulated in the contract, what we're paying for at a particular rate in the contract. Now, the thing that Binford and Preibisch are interested in is how the addition of Mexican labor to Caribbean labor sources that were the traditional sources of labor for the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, the SAWP, what the addition of these Mexican laborers does within the context of the SAWP. How does it change things? How does it change things not just for the growers, but also for Caribbean workers who have traditionally come up through the SAWP? It's worth noting in passing that Canada is a member of the British Commonwealth, and a lot of the labor supply nations involved in the SAWP, like Jamaica, for example, are also members of the British Commonwealth. So that there's some level of sort of an historical affinity between these nations. So the addition of Mexico is also a step outside of that sort of Commonwealth relationship, and it's interesting not just because of the inclination of the SAWP on the Canadian side to look beyond its traditional Commonwealth connections, but also because it signals that there's an interest not just in maintaining that kind of relationship, but in thinking principally economically about what are the sources of labor that will produce the most surplus value. Okay, moving on. So you can see in the map here that you've got sort of two main sources of labor coming from Mexico, coming from the Caribbean, but especially from Jamaica, up into Canada. They initially went to Ontario, which is the province where Toronto is, and since then, other provinces have become included, Quebec, for example, and some of the provinces in the prairies. But the principle of the SAWP has remained the same. Drawing labor from Mexico and the Caribbean to fill a gap in the agricultural labor sector. So what does that mean? So this is a program that started in 1966. It expanded to include Mexican workers in 1974. The contracts are typically around 5 months. They vary, as we'll see, from one agricultural sector to another. But typically they're around that period. So you can think from sort of spring through to the end of summer. So from planting through harvest, more or less, is when the contract would be for. And so the workers would come up with this program. They would stay in housing, usually on site on the particular enterprise where they're working. They would, in a typical scenario, they would over time pay off the airfare that had been covered by the employer initially to get to get the workers to the workplace. And at the end of their contract, then they would return to their home countries. So you can see it's for a limited period, that period that's crucial for the agriculturalists in terms of getting their crops planted, getting their crops tended to, and then harvested. And if there's any processing of the crops, then getting that processing done so that they can get their products to market. And what it signals, though, is that even back as far as 1966, really the recognition emerged in the post-World War II period, but it was put into this program in 1966. There was a recognition that there was a shortage of Canadians who would do this kind of labor for a wage. The farmers would do it if, say, they had family farms. The owners of the farms would do some of it, but they simply didn't have the personnel to do all of the work necessary to get their products out and to market. And so the Canadian government developed this program in 1966 in order to make up for that shortfall of Canadian labor so that these farms could continue to function. There were certain things built into the contracts, so anybody who came on the contract was governed by the same law as everyone else in Canada. So employers had to do things like meet minimum wage laws. There were stipulations around the length of the work week and the length of the work day. And so in many respects, on paper at least, the workers were covered by the same laws that applied to anybody else working in Canada. How that worked out in practice was not always quite so clear. As you see in the chapter, one of the things that made Mexican laborers attractive to many of the employers is that they would complain less about things like not getting their stipulated break times during the workday. They might be more willing to work an extra day during the week, especially at peak times. And that, of course, is to the owner's preference, even if it's not necessarily to the laborer's preference, and even if it's not exactly in accord with the law governing labor relations in Canada. Okay, so that's just a snapshot of the SAWP program. Of course, Professor Binford has written an entire book about it, so there is a lot more to be said about it. I just sort of wanted to give you the basic orientation so that you know why these workers are coming to Canada, under what conditions they're coming to Canada, and what the interest of the Canadian employers is in having them come up to Canada. Now, they seek then to explain how Mexican labor became the majority of SAWP workers. So remember, in 1973, Mexican workers are not part of this program at all. So their number is 0. Starting in 1974, you see a small number of Mexican workers enter the system as the Canadian government has now negotiated this program with the Mexican government. And this is an important detail. The Canadian government negotiates all of these arrangements bilaterally with countries. So there will be one set of negotiations with Mexico, another set of negotiations with Jamaica, another set with Trinidad and Tobago, and so forth. So they're not negotiating them sort of on a template that applies in exactly the same way to all of these different countries. And it makes it harder for representatives of these countries to coordinate with one another to present, so to speak, a united front in negotiating with Canada. No, they're all done bilaterally. So, excuse me, Binford and Preibisch then want to examine what this introduction of Mexican labor does within the SAWP and how it is that they became the majority of the SAWP workers. The explanation that they find persuasive hinges on this notion of racialization of labor. So racialization involves those instances where social relations between people have been structured by the signification of human biological characteristics in such a way as to define and construct social collectivities. So as definitions go, this is not absolutely transparent. There's a little bit to unpack here. To begin with then, the thing that's crucial is that they're focusing on social relations. So again, this should have a little bit of an echo of Marx for you. That social relations was the was the principle that he opposed to idealism, the idealism of Hegel, for example, that he wants to look at concrete, actual, living human beings in the social organization that they have with one another. So we're starting off, okay, so far so good. We're starting off with something that sounds very materialist. Social relations between people, but how they've been structured, so how these social relationships have been structured by the signification of human biological characteristics. So this is important. They're saying not social relations as they're structured by human biological characteristics, but rather social relations as they have been structured by the signification. So what it is that the relevant social bodies mean by, or what meaning they assign to human biological characteristics. And then how these definitions define and construct social collectivities. So that if you take a group of people, say Jamaicans on the one hand, Mexicans on the other, and you say each group has its own biological characteristics, and we assign particular meaning to those characteristics, so different meanings to the different groups, because we see the characteristics as importantly distinct from one another, then the way that we assign those meanings and the content of those meanings determines how we will form our social relations with the members of those groups. So that the individual workers then, in a sense, become defined by their assigned membership within one of these groups that is defined by their biological characteristics, or at least the signification assigns itself to these biological characteristics. The important thing then with this is that the biological characteristics don't actually need to be determinative of how much surplus value individuals from that group will be able to offer the planters and the growers, but rather what's important is the meaning that the employers assign to those biological characteristics and how they think of them as signaling a different propensity for producing surplus value. Now, there's a potential problem here then if we're thinking of this in Marxian terms, right? Because now we're in the realm of ideas, of signification, of meaning. That sounds awfully idealistic rather than materialistic. So what's going on here? Well, that's a question I don't want to answer right now. I want to let the rest of the chapter try to answer that for you as we go. So I'll come back to that, but it's something that I want to flag here because it could look as if Binford and Preibisch are taking a step away from Marx and a step toward these kind of idealistic notions of social change. That is, the idea that the ideas that we have about the world are the things that structure our social relationships, rather than our social relationships structuring our ideas about the world. Okay, so then racialization allows capitalist employers, the Canadian growers, to justify lower wages to racialized groups, reflecting their devaluation on the basis of social, physical, and cultural attributes the employers attribute to them. On the one hand, what this is signaling is that Canadians, for the purposes of the part of Ontario that we're talking about in this chapter, white Canadians, are simply not willing to do the work that the growers want at minimum wage. You would have to pay them significantly more if you were to get them to go out and work in the fields and work in the greenhouses the way the SAWP workers do. So the SAWP program then has this sort of racialized content in that it's the racialized notions of these laborers that justifies for the employers paying them minimum wage, yes, but not paying them, so to speak, the market value for Canadian workers to do the same work. The market value for Canadian workers would be significantly above minimum wage. Again, though, the crucial thing here is that this racialization is not about actual attributes of these individuals, or not necessarily, and maybe I'll leave that question open for now, but it's about the attribution by the growers of particular propensities to the SAWP workers on the basis of perceived racial difference. That's the crucial thing. That's where the justification comes in. We can see that differentially racializing groups and placing them in competition for the same position also short circuits labor solidarity. So partly this comes back to the point that I was making earlier about the Canadian government organizing bilateral negotiations for the different participating countries in the SAWP program. But also what this points to is that where the workers from these different countries could have a kind of a natural affinity for one another as workers, and therefore could organize themselves internally as a labor force and use that kind of collective organization to bargain collectively with the employers participating in the SAWP program. Instead, what you get here is a way for employers to kind of drive a wedge between the different groups, between Caribbean workers as a whole and Mexican workers as a whole, through racialization and through the expression of employer preference for certain kinds, for workers who are racialized in a certain way for certain fields. Sorry, that was an unintentional pun. For certain areas of agricultural production, and then workers who are racialized in another way for other areas of agricultural production. So they point out in the chapter, for example, that growers have a preference for Caribbean workers for things like peaches and apples, tree fruit, in other words, because they have the idea that they're just better at picking because they're taller. And Mexican workers, they say, are better for field work where there's more stooping. So it could be things like strawberries, say, or tomatoes or cucumbers or what have you. So there's this notion that the physical structure of the individuals, based on where they come from, determines how the employers see them as having natural capabilities for certain kinds of work, as if things like ladders don't exist, so that, it's impossible for a Mexican worker to pick fruit as efficiently as a Jamaican worker because height is a requirement. When you're able then to insert that kind of wedge between different sorts of, say, nationally defined bodies of labor, then it makes it significantly harder for them to organize collectively, because now they're in competition with one another. Not all of these jobs are created equal. Some of them have longer duration contracts, and therefore the workers in those will net more income than those who work in areas that have shorter seasons, for example, and therefore shorter contracts. So that you get more competition for the types of labor that will earn more money for the worker. Therefore, as I say, it short circuits labor solidarity, makes them competitors with one another rather than allies with one another. So as Binford and Preibisch explain, from the perspective of growers, selecting between Mexican and Caribbean labor is a question of labor productivity. That is, getting more productivity for every dollar of wages they pay. Again, this idea of increasing surplus value. So you'll remember from when we were talking about Marx that when the worker and the owner enter into a contract, that contract stipulates how much they're going to get paid. So let's say the worker is paid in these cases on an hourly basis. And for each hour they work, they get paid whatever the minimum wage is. So let's say the minimum wage is X Canadian dollars. What they produce during that hour of work and all of the hours of work they perform during the day will be X plus something. Let's say the value that they produce is X Canadian dollars plus 1 Canadian dollar, so that for every hour they work, they're producing $1 of surplus for the employer above and beyond what they're actually getting paid. What, from the grower's point of view, is important is if there's a way that they can increase that $1 of surplus in any way. And if switching from one group of laborers, one national group of laborers to another, allows them to increase that $1 to, say, $1.50, then that's going to increase the amount of surplus, clearly, that they're able to extract from the workers. And so this is the consideration that the employers go through when they're deciding which body of labor they want to draw upon. So a related aspect of racialization is the growers' perceptions that workers from particular backgrounds have natural aptitudes for specific types of work. This is what I was just saying a moment ago. So again, they think Jamaican workers are particularly well suited to working in tobacco. Mexican workers are particularly well suited to greenhouse work. And so you find real concentrations of those two types of workers in those two areas. That's going to be consequential for the different groups of workers. We get then this funneling of types of workers, of nationally defined, but also then racialized workers into the different spheres of agriculture. Now, another thing that contributes to the sort of inertia of who winds up in what agricultural area is the naming system. So if as an employer you hire, let's say, 50 workers, and you see that 40 of those workers really work the way that you would like, then you know who they are. And so for the subsequent year, you can name those workers and request that they be sent back to your farm. And if the workers are agreeable with that, they want to go back to the same farm, then great. Then that's how the naming system works. You get to maintain the same group of workers year after year after year, so that there are some workers who will come back to the same farms for decades. And it also means, though, that if a particular employer is especially hard on labor, then it's going to be harder for them to use the naming system to get the same workers back year after year, because they will be more reluctant to work for that person if they think that they can get work on another farm. The trick, of course, is that if the worker turns down the option of returning to the same farm by using the naming system, there's no guarantee that they'll get hired on another farm. So it's a risky move. You have to decide, is it a greater risk to go back to this place where the working conditions are not very good, where the owner might be a disagreeable sort of person, or to decline that and see if I can get work on another farm? That it's a gamble. From the owner's point of view, it's a much lower stakes proposition. Why? Because even if they don't get the workers who they name through the naming system to come back to their farms, there's a reserve of more workers who will be agreeable to coming and working on this farm, even though they haven't been named to it, even though they might not have worked on it before. And so that means that the employers are, through the naming system, in a stronger negotiating position, and they are more likely to be able to fill the ranks of employees that they need, even if they don't wind up with exactly the people who they wished to get. But the point of this then is that this is a way that when people of a particular national background become identified with a specific crop or a specific way of producing cucumbers, say in greenhouses, or tomatoes, then the naming system helps to keep those nationalities associated with those particular crops and those particular methods, because it builds in this kind of inertia into the system. On top of this, though, on top of the perceptions of, on the part of growers that is, on top of the perceptions of which workers are best suited to which kinds of work based on their biological attributes, they also have this idea that specific nationalities like certain types of work. So there's the discussion with one of the growers of how Vietnamese women were particularly adept at packaging certain crops. So not the field work, but just the packaging of it, and like tying the certain quantities of whatever the crop is together into a single package. And so the employers then have the idea not just that they're good at this, but that they actually like it. And in a way, that gives the owners a further alibi in the racialization of hiring, because it allows them to feel like they're giving the workers work that they actually really enjoy, as if they're doing a favor for the workers, not just of offering them a job, but of offering them a job that they will like, that they prefer to do. As if, in the end, what they're doing is catering to the workers' preferences rather than their own. Binford and Preibisch, not surprisingly, are skeptical of whether this is the case. Because you can imagine, again, as a worker, when your employer comes at the end of the season, you're considering the naming system, whether you're going to get named to come back to this position again. Maybe employment opportunities in your home country are not very great. And the employer asks, so do you like doing this work? Well, the honest answer might not be yes, but the strategic answer certainly is. And so you might very well be loose with the truth and say that, yeah, actually this is great. I'm very happy doing this. Let me keep doing it. And so it reinforces this notion that the employers are catering to the desires of the workers rather than the other way around. At base, though, employers hire workers they think will produce the greatest productivity, which is to say the greatest surplus value. In addition, the strategy pitted workers against one another along racial and national lines. Again, this idea that the naming system and the perception that specific attributes condition workers for particular kinds of work, and the idea that certain kinds of workers like to do certain kinds of work, allows employers, not necessarily even intentionally, to drive a wedge between the workers as workers and keep them identified with their national origin rather than their material conditions, which is to say their status as workers. Now, as I said, these decisions had real impacts on the ability of workers from different places to earn. So that some sectors, tobacco is an example that they raise, with short contracts, gave Caribbean workers around 20% fewer hours, shorter season, shorter contract, 20% fewer hours, and nearly 20% less income during the contract season. So being named to come back to work in tobacco, again, it's risky to decline to come back to work at the same tobacco farm when you're not sure if you're going to be able to get hired in another sector. You, as a Jamaican worker, might prefer to work in a greenhouse, but because that's associated strongly with Mexican workers, you're taking a big risk to decline the invitation through the naming system to go back to a tobacco farm where you're not going to make as much money. And so again, this has real consequences. It produces real competition amongst laborers from different national backgrounds. It pits them against one another. Further, then, because of the durability of racialized stereotypes, that is to say, the stereotypes that people produce about workers on a racial basis, they endure over a long period. It's hard to change people's ideas about these things. So because of that durability, the fortunes of specific groups fluctuated with the fortunes of specific crops or sectors. So that, for example, to go back to tobacco, when the Canadian government engaged in a campaign to advertise the health risks of tobacco products, to educate the Canadian public about the risks that they took for smoking, let's say, or for chewing tobacco, that had an impact on the profitability of tobacco, and so it was an agricultural sector that went into decline. That meant that there was a smaller demand for workers, and so those national workers, like say Jamaicans, who traditionally worked in tobacco, were disproportionately affected by the decline in that sector. Whereas over a similar period, a comparable period, the products of greenhouses. So if you go to a supermarket in New York in the winter, you'll find a lot of vine tomatoes, for example, that were grown in Canada, or cucumbers. You'll find those shrink-wrapped cucumbers are almost entirely from Canadian greenhouses in Ontario, about an hour north of Toronto. There's this huge sector, or in Leamington, which is to the west of Toronto. They produce a huge quantity of the greenhouse products, and so as it has taken off, its demand for workers has increased, and it has been very, very strongly associated with Mexican workers. So workers with Mexican nationality do disproportionately well when that economic sector takes off. What we get then with these trends is a shift from racialization to racism. So what do they mean by that? They mean that employers are going to have specific kinds of prejudices about the inherent capabilities of workers defined along racial lines, so that they're going to think, to put it in more concrete terms, that black workers from the Caribbean are going to have a particular set of attributes around height and strength, for example, and that Mexican workers are going to have a distinct set of attributes, and that and so they, as employers, have to make their hiring decisions with these prejudices in mind, or at least with the content of these prejudices in mind. And again, the naming system builds a certain kind of durability into these preconceptions, these prejudices that they have. These notions that for greenhouses, no, Jamaican workers are not really suited to this kind of work because of their biology. So it's a shift from racialization to racism, giving preference to workers of a certain kind of racial background over others of a different racial makeup. From the point of view of workers, then, there's only really a motivation to shift from one group of employees defined along national and racial lines to another group if that change promises much greater profits, much greater productivity. Only under those conditions will a grower switch. And this is what happened with Mexican workers. Binford and Preibisch point out that other factors, though, also influence what employers see as good workers. So they want workers to be docile, obedient. They want them to stay throughout the entirety of their contracts. They want them not to complain about housing conditions, working overtime, and so forth. So that the more docile workers from a particular place seem to be, the more attractive they become for the employers. Now, what we find with in the chapter is that workers drawn from the Caribbean were predominantly of urban rather than a rural background. They were English speakers, of course, and there were, again, partly because of the long Commonwealth history shared between the countries, there were already established populations of other Caribbean people in Toronto, for example. So Toronto was not very far away from any of these agricultural centers where SAWP workers were employed. And so, given all of this, the Caribbean workers were much less likely to meet the criteria that make laborers attractive, right? So those criteria, again, docile, obedient, stay through the contracts, don't go AWOL, don't complain. Now, if you don't share a language with your employer, for example, it's harder for you to complain. You can complain to your fellow workers, but that doesn't go anywhere because, of course, the employer doesn't understand what you're saying, doesn't know what your complaints are. So that you might seem, in the end, more docile, more obedient, more agreeable than you actually feel. Whereas a shared language, English in the case of Ontario farms, means that Caribbean workers can voice their complaints. They might feel more emboldened or demand to be heard. They might be less willing to accept substandard working conditions, in particular if they know that they can just head off to Toronto where they have a network, maybe people they already know, maybe family, maybe friends of family, whatever the case may be, where there's much more likely a network for them to tap into, and they might be able to find work in the city instead of on the farm, even though that's not what the contract allows them to do. That's a greater possibility. And indeed, what do we see? A higher level of Caribbean workers going AWOL than Mexican workers. So for this collection of reasons, the Caribbean workers simply don't fit the criteria as well as Mexican workers do. And that means that employers, when they're making the decisions about who to hire, are more inclined toward Mexican workers. Mexican workers, by contrast, then, are more likely to be rural than urban, so more likely to have some kind of a farming background. They're going to be linguistically isolated from Canadians. They don't have the same kind of extensive networks that people of Caribbean backgrounds will have. And so they much more closely fit the idea of the good worker that the employers in the SAWP program want. And their isolation also makes them put up with boredom and routine with less complaint. Makes them less likely to go AWOL. Again, you can imagine if you're doing boring, repetitive work, but you don't really feel like you have anywhere to go. You can't just run off to Toronto and tap into a network there and find work doing something else, something that you like better, because the network doesn't exist, because you don't have the linguistic skills necessarily to take that initiative on your own. It makes going AWOL far less attractive, and it makes putting up with the boredom and the routine not easier to endure, but just harder to flee. So then Awol rates are a serious issue for labor source countries. And what we see in some of the examples is that the representatives of those countries don't often take the side of the workers in disputes, especially around issues of AWOL, of workers going AWOL, but rather they tend to take the side of the employer. Why? Because there's a lot at stake for them as well in terms of getting remunerations back to the home country. So in some cases, what they described is that when a particularly large number of workers from a certain part of the country went AWOL, the representatives, the government representatives from that country, who are charged with offering a pool of labor to the SAWP program, didn't just stop hiring those same people from that area, but they would sort of put an embargo on that entire district, so that even people who had never gone AWOL but who had the misfortune of coming from the same area in the country would effectively be penalized just for coming from that area where there had been a large number of AWOL workers in the past. They'll move to some other area, so that even internally now you start to see workers pitted against workers from another part of the country, so that it's not just a national divide, it's not just a racial divide of labor, but now it gets broken down to an even lower level of regional bodies of labor being pitted against one another within a given country. Again, that makes it very hard to form labor solidarity, but it also means that the SAWP program in another way is stacked against the workers, because the representatives from your own country don't identify with you as fellow members of your country, but rather they identify with the imperatives of the program, which is offer the workers who will promise the highest productivity, right? The most surplus value. Right, so they have then this kind of dual imperative. On the one hand, they want to find employment for their population. But on the other hand, they recognize how important remittances from the money earned in Canada to the home country are for the economy of that country. So they want to make sure in the end that the maximum possible number of people from their country find places within the SAWP program, because that allows the greatest volume of remittances to the home country. And if that means that they need to penalize one region in order to make sure that workers from other regions will fulfill their contracts and therefore will remain closer to that ideal of the docile, obedient worker that makes them employable, then that's what the representatives will try to ensure. So then the expectation is that source country officials side with employers in disputes. Otherwise, they find that employers will, as they coin the term in the book, country surf. They'll jump from country to country when they're dissatisfied with one source of labor. They'll jump from country to country to find a better source of labor. Better meaning a source of labor that maximizes productivity and minimizes all of these other kinds of problems of lodging complaints, of going AWOL, of demanding a day off a week, which will be stipulated in contracts usually, by demanding that they get their stipulated breaks during the day, and so forth. So another way that Binford and Preibisch see a shift from racialization to racism concerns sexuality. They note that a greater employer comfort with Mexican workers. They know that there is a greater comfort among Canadian employers with Mexican workers because they differ less from those white Canadians, and they socialize less with the host community. Now, they point out that many of the farm owners in, for example, Leamington, Ontario, just to the west of Toronto, are of Italian background. And so the history of Italians in Toronto and Ontario is not all that different from the history of Italians in the US, in that they were a large and significant immigrant population, but for a long time were not accepted by English white Canadians as exactly as white as the English were. And so there was a kind of the kind of immigrant stigma that is projected onto, has historically been projected onto Italians in the US as well. So then the process of, as it were, becoming white in Canada was not a straightforward one. So there are multiple potential points of identification between the Italian employers, again, who immigrated with a non-English language, and with Mexican workers who also will arrive not as English speakers, who will arrive looking more like the Italian descendants in Canada, and so forth. So that it's what they're proposing in the book then is that it's easier for the employers to feel at ease with Mexican workers than with, say, Jamaican workers. Ultimately then, Binford and Preibisch explain what matters is not the truth of national racial aptitudes, but rather the employer's beliefs about what makes a good worker. In this way, racialization makes some racial, ethnic, and national groups more desirable than others, while simultaneously pitting labor-providing countries against one another. So, okay, that's the end of the chapter. The question that I posed at the beginning is, well, that sounds an awful lot like what we're dealing with is the realm of ideas, not the material realm. But you'll remember that one of the points that Marx makes is that the ruling ideas are the ideas of a ruling class. And so as long as these ideas reflect the interests of the growers, and they wind up doing that, they wind up having an identifiable material basis. Why? Because they make labor organization difficult. They make it so that the workers have to compete with one another, and the way that they compete with one another is by becoming closer and closer to that ideal worker who maximizes productivity, so that the justifications are not necessarily going to line up with reality, but they wind up serving a particular set of interests of the employers by sustaining the disadvantage of the worker in negotiations with the employer, so that they wind up having a material basis after all. At least arguably they do. You might have a different view, and that would be interesting. Thank you.